The sun burned low over the endless rows of cane, draping the plantation in a sickly orange haze. The owner, Mr. Hargrove, stood on the porch of his grand but decaying mansion. His eyes, cold and unreadable, shifted to the trembling figure of his daughter, Marianne. She was pale, restless, and heavy in body, yet there was a strange innocence in her round face. Marianne's hands shook as she clutched the folds of her dress. She had been told this day would come, but she never believed her father would truly hand her over. Down by the slave quarters, a figure waited. Chains hung loosely around his wrists, yet the iron never clinked. His head remained bowed, his skin darker than the night itself, and his silence heavier than the humid air. They called him Samuel, but whispers among the other slaves claimed that Samuel was no man at all. Some said he had been brought here decades ago, unchanged, unaged. Others swore they saw his eyes burning red in the moonlight, or that he could walk through locked doors. "Tonight," Mr. Hargrove muttered, "you will learn obedience, girl. He will take from you what I cannot teach, and when dawn rises, you will not be the same." Marianne's lips parted, her breath shallow. She turned to her father, desperate to speak, but the weight of his gaze silenced her. He gestured towards Samuel. The so-called slave lifted his head. For the first time, Marianne saw his face. His eyes were bottomless voids like open graves. He did not smile, nor did he blink. Yet without moving his lips, his voice crawled inside her mind. "I have waited long for you." Her knees buckled. The cane fields shuddered with a sudden gust, though no wind stirred. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching from Samuel's feet to coil around her ankles. The mansion groaned as if in warning. The other slaves bolted their doors, whispering prayers. They knew what Mr. Hargrove had unleashed. Marianne's scream caught in her throat as the darkness drew her closer to Samuel, and somewhere, deep in the earth beneath the plantation, something ancient stirred awake. Night fell over the Hargrove plantation, swallowing the fields in silence. The moon hung swollen and white above the cane, but its light never seemed to touch Samuel. He stood like a pillar of shadow, holding Marianne in place with nothing more than his gaze. Her father had retreated into the mansion, locking the doors, bolting the shutters. He wanted no part in what was to come. From his study window he watched the figures below, his daughter trembling and the creature he called a slave, waiting with inhuman patience. Marianne tried to whisper a prayer, but her voice broke into sobs. The shadows at her feet thickened, climbing up her skirts like living vines. She clawed at the air, but her fingers passed through them as though they were smoke. Samuel finally moved. His hand, long, skeletal, and cold as stone, rose toward her face. He did not touch her, yet Marianne's skin burned as though branded. "You carry more than flesh," the voice inside her mind rasped. "Your bloodline reeks of debt, unpaid, unbroken." She gasped, choking on the air, her eyes bulging as visions clawed through her skull. She saw her family's history. Slaves whipped until the earth turned red, bodies buried beneath the cane, and a contract sealed in blood long before she was born. Her father's fortune, his power, his land, none of it was his. It was bought with her soul. "No!" Marianne screamed, clutching her temples. "I don't want this!" But the plantation answered with silence. Even the insects had gone mute. From the corners of the fields, faint lights flickered, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They floated closer, and Marianne saw what they truly were, hollow eyes glowing in the skulls of the forgotten dead. Dozens of them, hundreds, they rose from the rows of cane, silent, waiting. Samuel's voice deepened, filling the night. "They are witnesses. They will not rest until you are changed, until the debt is claimed." The ground trembled beneath her feet. The cane swayed, though there was no wind. The mansion's windows rattled as if struck by unseen fists, and Marianne felt her body betray her. Her flesh began to tighten, her bones to stretch, her form reshaping against her will. She screamed, but her voice was no longer human. It was a howl that curdled blood. From his window, Mr. Hargrove shut his eyes, but the sound tore through the walls of his house, crawling into his ears, into his dreams. He had given his daughter away, not to a man, not even to a demon, but to the curse his own cruelty had created, and the curse was only beginning to feed. The night deepened, and the plantation seemed to breathe with the rhythm of Marianne's cries. The cane fields bent toward the mansion as though leaning in to listen. Every shuttered window rattled, every locked door quivered. Mr. Hargrove sat in his study, whiskey glass trembling in his hand. He tried to drown the sounds, but the house itself betrayed him. Whispers slid down the walls, voices that spoke in a dozen tongues, voices of those he had forgotten, those buried beneath his land. Your blood will pay. Your daughter is the price. We are not gone. We are the roots. He clutched his head, but the voices pressed harder, seeping into his skull until his vision blurred. When he looked into the mirror above his desk, he no longer saw himself, only a gaunt figure in chains, staring back with hatred. Outside, Marianne's body writhed in the dirt, her skin split in places, dark veins pulsing with a black fire that spread through her flesh. Her eyes glowed faintly like lanterns in a fog. She wasn't herself anymore, not entirely. Samuel stood over her, unblinking. The curse takes what it is owed, and you, child of Hargrove, are its vessel. Marianne clawed at the ground. "Why me?" she screamed. "I didn't choose this." "You were chosen the moment your father sold his soul," Samuel said, his voice like iron grinding against stone. "Your family's sins are carved into the roots of this land, and now the land carves back." The field erupted. From beneath the soil, skeletal hands burst forth, grasping at her arms, her legs, her throat. They didn't pull her down, they held her still, forcing her to feel the full weight of the curse. Marianne's screams grew sharper, echoing into the night. Her flesh rippled, twisting as though something inside her was trying to claw its way out. And then she fell silent. Her body rose slowly from the ground, though no hands held her. Her feet dangled inches above the earth, her head tilted back, and when her eyes opened, they were no longer her own. The glow inside them was endless. Samuel bowed his head, not in reverence, but in recognition. "It is done." The slaves in their quarters prayed harder, pressing their hands over their ears to block out what they already knew. They had a new master now, not of flesh and blood, but of curse and shadow. The cane bent lower, as if worshipping her. The soil shivered, drunk on the sacrifice. And in the silence that followed, the plantation took its first breath under her rule. Dawn never truly came to the plantation that morning. The sun rose, but its light seemed thin, pale, unable to pierce the heavy shadows clinging to the cane fields. Inside the mansion, Mr. Hargrove had not slept. His hands shook as he lit another candle, though the wax from a dozen before had already melted across his desk. The whispers had not stopped through the night. They had only grown louder, clearer. "Your daughter is ours. You sowed the fields with blood. Now the harvest begins." He stumbled toward the window, parting the curtains with trembling finger. What he saw nearly drove him mad. Marianne was still in the fields. She no longer stood like the frightened girl he had given away. Her body was straighter, taller, her frame stretched with unnatural strength. Her eyes, twin lanterns of white fire, scanned the plantation like a predator seeking prey. And the cane itself. It moved around her, bowing, twisting, almost breathing. The plants had grown taller overnight, thick stalks bristling like spears, their blades sharp as razors. Samuel stood at her side, head lowered, but for the first time Mr. Hargrove noticed something different. The chains that had once bound Samuel were gone, melted into the earth. His shadow seemed longer, darker, merging with Marianne's. A cold realization struck him. Samuel had never been the curse. He had only been its guardian, its vessel. Now his daughter was the heart of it. Mr. Hargrove whispered, "What have I done?" As if hearing him, Marianne's glowing eyes turned toward the mansion. Though she stood far across the field, he felt her gaze burn into his chest. His breath caught, his heart skipped, and then her lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. That evening, the first deaths began. A worker stumbled from the cane, his body torn open by unseen claws. Another was found hanging from the branches of a tree, though no rope was tied around his neck, just the twisting grip of vines. The slaves refused to enter the fields, whispering that the land was alive now and hungry. By nightfall, screams echoed from the far edges of the plantation. Figures moved between the stalks, figures with hollow eyes, the restless dead answering Marianne's call. The curse had chosen its queen, and her rule would be written in blood. The night fell heavier than ever before. No stars dared to shine above the plantation, and the moon itself seemed swallowed by thick black clouds. A choking silence blanketed the land, broken only by the rustle of cane stalks that moved though no wind stirred. The slaves huddled together in their quarters, whispering prayers, clutching crosses, charms, and scraps of faith, but they knew the truth. Nothing holy lived on this soil anymore. From within the cane fields, Marianne walked barefoot, her white gown trailing in the dirt, stained dark. Her skin had grown paler, stretched thin over her bones, yet her presence was more terrible than before. Every step she took made the earth tremble softly, as if the ground itself obeyed her. Behind her, the dead followed, silent, endless rows of them, their hollow eyes glowing with faint light. Some bore the marks of their deaths, broken necks, lash scars, crushed skulls, yet they moved as though commanded by a single will. Samuel walked at her side, though. She no longer appeared bound. His form flickered like smoke, one moment flesh, the next shadow. "They will resist," he told her. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. Marianne turned her lantern-like gaze upon him. "Then they will suffer," she whispered, though her words echoed as if spoken by many voices at once. The mansion loomed ahead. Mr. Hargrove had locked every door, every shutter, but his barricades meant nothing now. As Marianne approached, the vines and cane pressed forward, wrapping around the walls, tightening like a fist. Inside, he loaded his rifle with trembling hands. His face was drenched in sweat, his lips muttering fragments of prayers he had never spoken in earnest before. The first strike came with a sound like thunder. The front doors burst inward, wood splintering like bone. Vines snaked through the hallways, knocking down paintings, shattering mirrors, dragging furniture aside. Mr. Hargrove fired blindly into the dark. The shot echoed through the mansion, but when the smoke cleared, Marianne stood in the doorway. Her eyes glowed brighter than the flame of his rifle. Her smile stretched too wide, her teeth sharp, inhuman. "Father," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers, "your debt is due." The floor shook violently, cracks splitting the wood. From beneath the house, skeletal arms clawed upward, seizing his legs, dragging him down inch by inch. He screamed, thrashing, firing again and again, but the bullets only sank uselessly into the swarm of shadows. As the ground consumed him, his final sight was his daughter's face, no longer Marianne, but something ancient, wearing her flesh. And then the soil swallowed him whole. The house grew still, the lights flickered and died, and the plantation belonged fully to her. Writing, the mansion stood silent in the days that followed, its windows dark, its halls abandoned. But the land around it pulsed with new life, dark life, unnatural life. The cane had grown taller than a man, sharper than steel, its stalks whispering even when the air was still. The slaves no longer worked the fields. They no longer dared to. Those who tried to flee in the first nights were never seen again. Their cries had echoed across the rows until silence swallowed them whole. The others stayed close to their quarters, trapped by fear. But even there, safety was an illusion. At dusk, shadows moved through the cabins. The dead, those hollow-eyed revenants, came to stand among the living, watching them with unblinking stares. They did not touch, did not speak, they only waited. It was worse than death itself. On the third night, Marianne came to them. She drifted into the quarters barefoot, her gown trailing like mist. The children whimpered, hiding in their mother's skirts, while the men pressed their backs against the walls. Her eyes swept over them, glowing in the candlelight. "You were bound to my father," she said, her voice layered, as though hundreds spoke through her throat. "Now you are bound to me." One of the men dared to whisper, "We are already bound. We cannot be more enslaved than this." Her head tilted, her smile curling. The shadows behind her stirred like a rising tide. "You misunderstand," she replied. "You will not serve. You will become." The candles flickered, then died. In the absurd, a pitch darkness, screams erupted, screams that choked into silence one by one as the shadows filled every corner of the cabin. When morning came, the quarters stood empty. The workers were gone, only the faint sound of the cane rustling remained. That evening, those who survived saw new figures among the dead in the fields, faces they had once known, friends, brothers, children, hollow-eyed now, their wills broken, their souls devoured. And at the center of it all stood Marianne, her arms raised, her gown soaked in the dew of the cursed earth. The plantation was no longer a farm, it was a kingdom of the damned. Writing. That evening, the plantation seemed to breathe. The cane swayed though no wind touched it, moving like a great green sea, whispering words too faint to be human. The mansion loomed against the twilight sky, its windows glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, as if the house itself now pulsed with a heart. From the fields came figures. The missing workers had returned, but not as they once were. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their skin carrying the marks of death. They moved in silence, their footsteps in perfect rhythm, as if commanded by a single thought. The survivors who had not been taken hid inside the crumbling sheds, clutching at crosses and charms. But even in hiding, they could not escape the truth. The dead had joined the curse, and Marianne was their queen. She walked at the head of the procession, her hair trailing behind her like strands of black smoke. The gown she wore no longer looked of fabric, but of shadows themselves, clinging to her body and shifting with every step. Her eyes, burning with white fire, scanned the land like torches in the dark. Samuel remained close at her side, his presence heavier than ever, though his form was less human now. His arms stretched long and jagged, his features blurring like ash caught in wind. Where he stepped, the ground blackened, as if scorched by invisible fire. The slaves, still untouched, whispered among themselves that Samuel had once been the jailer of the curse, but now Marianne had become the curse itself. She commanded, and Samuel obeyed. At midnight she gathered them all, the living, the dead, and those who trembled in between. They stood in a circle around the old well at the center of the plantation. Its stones were cracked, its water black, said to be dug long ago over a burial pit. Marianne raised her hand. The air thickened until it was hard to breathe. The dead fell to their knees, heads bowed, waiting. The living who resisted cried out, but their voices were smothered by unseen hands. This land, Marianne's voice thundered, layered with countless echoes, was fed with your blood, broken by your bones. Tonight it becomes whole again. No man owns it. No master commands it. Only the curse. The well began to boil, its water rising in thick black waves, spilling over the stones. From its depths came more hands, more skulls, more twisted forms clawing their way out. The smell of rot swept across the fields as if the earth itself had exhaled centuries of graves. The survivors broke then. Some fell to their knees begging for mercy. Others tried to flee, but the cane closed around them like a cage, its blades slicing flesh, forcing them back into the circle. There was no escape. Marianne's face shone with a terrible light. She spread her arms wide, and the shadows of the fields bent toward her like worshippers. The transformation of the plantation was complete. It was no longer land, no longer earth. The cane sliced into the flesh of those who ran, its blades cutting deeper than steel, driving them back toward the circle of the damned. Their screams filled the night, but did not rise above the chorus of whispers that spilled from the well. The water surged higher, forming shapes, arms, faces, entire bodies made from liquid shadow. They crawled onto the soil, joining the host of the dead already gathered. Their hollow mouths opened in unison, and a sound like 1,000 graves splitting apart shook the plantation. Marianne stood tall at the center, her gown of living shadow swirling around her. The fire in her eyes flared brighter until it seemed the sky itself dimmed to hide from her gaze. She raised her arms, and the dead bent low, bowing as though she were an empress crowned in bone. "Do you see now?" she whispered, though her voice thundered across the fields. "There is no master but the land, no law but the curse, and I," her pale hand pressed against her chest, "am its vessel." One of the surviving men, trembling but desperate, cried out, "You are not the land, you are not the curse, you are still flesh, your blood still runs." Before he could finish, the soil beneath his feet split open. Vines shot upward, coiling around his limbs, dragging him screaming into the earth. His cries cut off abruptly, and when the vines receded, only his hollow-eyed shell remained, standing in silence, swaying with the others. The rest of the survivors broke into sobs. There was no hope left, no God listening. Only the endless night of Marianne's reign. Samuel stepped forward, his form flickering between shadow and bone. His voice rumbled low, almost reverent. "The land is yours, Queen of Ashes, but beware. What you awaken hungers without end. It will not stop at these fields." Marianne turned her burning eyes upon him. "Then it will spread," she said coldly. "Every acre, every town, every soul will bend, as this plantation has bent. The curse is not a prison, Samuel. It is a kingdom, and kingdoms must grow." A terrible silence followed her words, broken only by the rustling cane, but this time the sound was louder, stronger, like applause rising from countless unseen hands. The plantation itself approved, and with that, the true conquest began. Writing. The cane tightened like a prison, slicing flesh and dragging the living back into the circle. Their cries mingled with the groan of the well, whose black water bubbled like molten tar. The night sky seemed to recoil, clouds circling overhead, as though the heavens themselves wished to look away. Marianne stood over them all, her shadow stretching across the field until it swallowed every corner of the plantation. Her gown writhed like a living thing, whispering in a tongue older than man. Her lantern-fire eyes blazed brighter with each scream that echoed into the night. The well erupted. Dark water spewed into the air, raining down in a foul storm that burned wherever it touched. Those struck clutched at their skin, which blistered and split, only to knit back together in grotesque new shapes. They staggered upright, hollow-eyed and obedient, added to her growing army. Samuel watched, silent, his form shifting between man and smoke. His voice at last rumbled from the void of his chest. "The circle is complete. The dead obey. But to spread the curse, blood must leave this land." Marianne turned to him slowly, her hair streaming like smoke in an unseen wind. "Then we will leave," she said. "This soil has fed on its debt. Now it hungers for more. The towns will bow as these fields have bowed. The world will drink the curse until there is no pure earth left." The dead shifted restlessly, their movements like the sway of cane stalks in a storm. From the darkness, more figures approached, souls buried beyond the plantation, drawn by her call. They crawled from forgotten graves, staggering toward the light in her eyes. The slaves who still lived huddled together, whispering their last prayers. But even their words faltered, for faith itself seemed to weaken in her presence. Their gods had abandoned them, or perhaps had been swallowed whole by her ascension. The mansion's great bell tolled without a hand to strike it. Its sound rolled across the land, low and mournful, a funeral knell for every living thing. Marianne raised her arms high. The cane bent low as though bowing. The ground quaked. The well screamed as though alive, and from the horizon, far beyond the plantation's borders, dogs began to howl. The curse had awakened something greater than the land. The march of death was about to begin. It was a kingdom of the dead, and every soul upon it belonged to her. The bell's final toll carried far into the night, a dirge for the living and an anthem for the dead. The sound rolled across the fields, over the forests, spilling into the distant towns like a warning no one would understand until it was far too late. From the plantation gates, the march began. The dead moved first. An endless tide of hollow-eyed revenants, their footsteps pounding in unison, shaking the earth beneath them. Their faces bore every wound of their deaths, slit throats that never bled, shattered jaws locked in silent screams, backs bent from years of toil, now straightened with unnatural strength. Behind them came the newly reborn, their bodies warped by the black rain from the well. Their limbs were twisted but powerful, their skin cracked like dry earth, leaking faint streams of shadow. They carried no weapons, their bodies themselves had become instruments of ruin, and at the head of it all walked Marianne. Her shadow stretched before her like a banner of conquest, her gown of living darkness swirling with whispers that no mortal tongue could form. She walked barefoot, Yet each step left the soil burning black, as though the curse itself planted roots wherever she passed. Samuel strode at her side, his form now nothing more than smoke and bone, his chains trailing like serpents. Though once he had been the keeper of the curse, now he followed like a general obeying his queen. They passed through the cane fields, and the plants bent aside as though in reverence, past the quarters, which now stood hollow and abandoned, past the great house, where the windows glowed faintly with a pale, watchful light. At the edge of the plantation, Marianne paused, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. Beyond the trees, beyond the swamps and rivers, the lights of a distant town flickered faintly. Small, vulnerable, alive. She raised her hand. The march halted. Every revenant stood still, waiting, the silence pressing so heavily that even the night creatures dared not stir. Marianne lowered her hand slowly, and in that simple gesture, the entire host began to move forward again. The curse had taken the plantation. Now it would take the world. Writing, the town of Blackwood slept beneath the moon, unaware of the nightmare that crept toward its borders. Wooden houses leaned close together along the main street, lanterns flickering dimly on their porches. The church bell sat silent in its tower, its cross dark against the stars. But the silence did not last. From the swamps beyond the trees came the sound of many feet moving in unison, a low rumble, like a storm rolling across the earth. The dogs barked first, then fell silent, tails tucked, their bodies shaking as though they sensed what human ears could not. Horses in their stables kicked against their stalls, eyes wide and wild, and then the smell arrived. A stench of wet soil, of graves long disturbed, of rot carried on the night wind. The townsfolk stirred from their beds, frowning, whispering, clutching lanterns as they stepped onto porches to see what the night concealed. The first shapes appeared at the edge of town, figures stumbling, faces hidden in shadow. At first glance they seemed like wanderers, but their numbers grew too quickly. Dozens, then hundreds. And as the lantern light caught their faces, the truth froze the breath in every chest. Hollow eyes, split jaws, bodies marked by wounds no living soul could bear. The dead had come to Blackwood. Panic spread. Mothers screamed for their children. Men grabbed rifles from over their fireplaces, hands trembling as they fumbled with powder and shot. The church bell rang at last, its frantic toll cutting through the night, but no one knew whether it was a call for prayer or a warning of doom. Down the main street, a man fired his musket. The shot ripped through one of the revenants, but the creature did not fall. It staggered, then straightened, black shadows spilling from the wound like smoke. Others pressed forward, unstoppable, their hollow eyes fixed on the living. And then she came. Marianne stepped from the swarm, her gown of shadow trailing across the dirt road. The lanterns flickered and died as her fire-bright eyes fell upon the town. Each step she took darkened the earth beneath her, as if she scorched the very soul of the land. The townsfolk stared, trembling, but could not look away. "Bow," she whispered, though the sound echoed through every wall, every heart, rattling in their bones. Some dropped to their knees instantly, overcome by fear. Others raised their rifles with shaking hands, but no weapon forged by man could save Blackwood now. Writing, the church bell of Blackwood rang wildly, its desperate toll shaking the night. Men poured into the street, with muskets and axes, women clutching children as they ran toward the chapel, believing its walls might shield them from the rising tide. But the tide was already here. The revenants stormed into the town, their hollow eyes blazing faintly in the dark. Shots rang out, black powder smoke filling the air, but the dead did not fall. Bullets tore through rotting flesh only for shadows to knit the wounds closed again. An axe split a skull, and the creature simply kept walking, head hanging loosely, eyes still fixed on its prey. The first line of men was torn down in seconds. Screams echoed through the alleys as shadows poured into homes, shattering windows, dragging the living into the street. The dead did not kill quickly. They bound, they twisted, they turned their captives into hollow-eyed soldiers for the growing horde. At the heart of the storm came Marianne. Her gown of shadow swept over the cobblestones, swallowing lantern light as she passed. The church bell faltered, then silenced, its rope snapping as the very tower seemed to groan in her presence. The priest stood at the chapel doors, clutching a crucifix, his voice shaking as he shouted scripture into the night. For a moment, the people felt hope, until Marianne's gaze fell on him. Her lips curved into a smile. She whispered a single word. The cross rotted in his hands. The wood blackened, the metal melted, dripping molten onto his skin. He screamed, falling to his knees as shadows coiled around him like serpents. His prayer ended in silence, and when he lifted his head again, his eyes were hollow. The crowd broke into chaos. Mothers screamed for their children, men shouted for wives, but the swarm split them apart, tearing families limb from limb. Samuel moved through the streets behind his queen, his chains dragging across the stones like iron serpents. Where they struck, walls cracked and collapsed, houses splitting open like rotten fruit. Above it all, Marianne raised her arms, and the dead paused, holding their captives down in the dirt. Her voice thundered across the town. Your land is mine, your blood is mine, your souls are mine. And Blackwood, swallowed by screams and shadow, bowed before its new queen. Writing his silence spread through the crowd like a plague. Hope died in every heart that had clung to him. The priest rose again, his hollow eyes glowing faintly as he joined the swarm. Chaos overtook Blackwood. The chapel doors burst inward as families tried to barricade themselves, but revenants crashed through windows, dragging children into the night. The pews overturned, candles spilled, flames licking the walls as screams filled the holy place. On the outskirts of town, a few men who had not fled gathered in a line, muskets raised. Their leader, Elias Graves, a farmer with a scar across his cheek, shouted orders with a voice that trembled but did not break. They fired in unison, the volley ripping into the first wave of shadows. The figures staggered, but Marianne raised her hand, and the bullets dissolved into dust before they hit the ground. The revenants surged forward, unbroken, like a tide reclaiming the shore. Elias cursed under his breath, gripping the iron axe he'd brought from his barn. Steel and fire, he muttered. Only steel and fire. He charged. Others followed, swinging axes, cleavers, torches. For the first time, the revenants faltered. Flames clung to their flesh, hissing as the shadows writhed and recoiled. A torch smashed into one of the creatures, and its body burst like tar, writhing as it burned. Marianne's eyes narrowed. So, they resist. Samuel stepped forward, his chains rattling, each link glowing faintly with a crimson pulse. With one swing, he shattered the burning revs. Nant to ash. Another strike sent men flying through the air, bones splintering as their screams filled the night. Still, Elias refused to retreat. He swung his axe at Samuel himself, sparks flying as steel clashed against chain. The force of the blow rattled his arms, but he stood his ground, shouting for the others to press forward. Marianne watched, curious, her smile fading. "This one has fire in him," she whispered. "Let us see how long it burns." The Battle of Blackwood raged on, steel and shadow colliding in the night, while above it all the cursed queen raised her arms to the sky. Clouds boiled overhead, the moon vanished, and a rain of black ash began to fall, coating the town in the color of death. Writing Elias Graves wiped the ash from his face, the firelight reflecting in his wild eyes. Around him, the brave handful of townsfolk still standing fought with everything they had, axes, pitchforks, torches. Every swing cost them dearly, but still they pressed forward, refusing to surrender their homes. Samuel loomed at the center of the street, his chains striking sparks against stone, his monstrous frame silhouetted by the flames of burning houses. Every swing of his cursed shackles sent men flying, bones snapping on impact. His hollow gaze fixed on Elias, and the earth seemed to quake beneath his advance. "Stand firm," Elias bellowed, raising his axe. "This beast can bleed!" The two clashed with a thunderous crash. Steel met chain, sparks exploding as Elias swung with all his might. Samuel countered with crushing force, each blow threatening to shatter the axe from Elias's grip. The sheer power of the revenant nearly drove him to his knees, but Elias gritted his teeth and fought back with savage determination. All around them, the fight raged. The townsfolk found that fire held power against the dead. Torches pressed against revenants made them shriek and recoil, their shadows writhing away like wounded serpents. But for every monster that burned, more pressed in from the dark. Families screamed as they were dragged from hiding places, shadows binding their limbs. Above the chaos, Marianne watched. Her shadowed gown billowed though there was no wind, her fiery eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "How touching," she whispered. "The rats think themselves lions." Elias roared and struck Samuel's chest, the axe blade biting deep. For a heartbeat, Samuel staggered, black ichor spilling from the wound. The crowd gasped, hope flickered in their hearts. But Samuel only laughed, a deep, inhuman sound that shook the flames themselves. His wound closed as the shadow stitched his flesh together. With one brutal swing, his chain wrapped around Elias's torso, yanking him from his feet and slamming him into the cobblestones with bone-cracking force. Blood filled Elias's mouth, but he spat it onto the ground and forced himself up again, staggering. "You'll have to do better than that," he growled. Marianne's smile widened. She raised her hand, and the sky split open with thunder. Black rain poured down upon Blackwood, hissing as it struck the earth. Where it touched the living, skin blistered, flesh blackened, and screams filled the night anew. The battle was no longer one of survival. It had become a massacre. Blood filled Elias's mouth, but he spat it onto the ground and forced himself up once more, staggering like a man half dead, yet too stubborn to fall. His knuckles were white against the haft of his axe, his breath ragged, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Samuel advanced, his chains dragging sparks across the cobblestones. Each step was a drumbeat of doom. "Break," the revenant growled, voice deep as the grave. But Elias shook his head. "Not tonight." From the alleyways, a ragged group of townsfolk emerged, carrying something swaddled in tarred cloth. At Elias's signal, they tore it open, revealing a long iron pike wrapped in carvings of strange symbols. Its head was jagged, blackened as though forged in some cursed fire. The revenants recoiled. Even Marianne tilted her head, her fiery gaze narrowing. "Ah, so the rats have teeth after all." Elias took the weapon in both hands, feeling its unnatural weight. The iron thrummed, almost alive, whispering in his ears. This was no ordinary tool of war. It was old, older than Blackwood, perhaps older than the land itself. The townsfolk called it the Widow's Fang, an heirloom buried deep beneath the church for generations, whispered to wound that which could not die. Samuel lunged, his chain lashing forward like a serpent. Elias met it with the fang, the impact shaking the ground. To the crowd's astonishment, the chain split. A shriek of pain tore from Samuel's throat, his body convulsing as the weapon's glow seared his shadow. Hope flared like a fire in the night. "Push them back!" Elias roared, and the survivors rallied, pressing forward with fire and steel. Revenants shrieked as torches found them, while Elias drove Samuel back with blow after furious blow, the widow's fang burning holes into his cursed flesh. But Marianne only smiled, her voice rolling across the battlefield like velvet and venom. "You think a trinket of iron can save you? You've only woken something deeper." The ground split beneath her feet. From the blackened soil a storm of hands erupted, skeletal, rotting, clawed, dragging themselves upward. Dozens, then hundreds more dead clawed into existence, their moans rising into a chorus of despair. Elias's moment of triumph faltered as the earth itself betrayed him. The true battle for Blackwood had only begun, writing. The earth split wide like a wound as Marianne's summons clawed their way out of the blackened soil, skeletons with shreds of rotting flesh, corpses in the garb of long-dead soldiers, farmers, children, all bound by hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Their cries rose in a chorus that drowned out the wind itself. Elias tightened his grip on the widow's fang. The weapon thrummed in his hands, its jagged head burning faintly with pale fire. Behind him, the last survivors of Blackwood, the scarred, the bleeding, the desperate, raised what remained of their torches and weapons. The town was in ruins, but their spirit had not yet broken. "Stand with me!" Elias shouted, his voice hoarse but thunderous. "If we fall, let it be as men and women who fought to our last breath." The revenant horde surged forward, a living tide of death. Samuel roared, swinging his chains in wide arcs, collapsing walls and scattering burning embers into the sky. His hollow eyes locked on Elias as though no one else existed. The battle began in a storm of fire and steel. Torches thrust into the oncoming dead lit them ablaze, their shrieks piercing the night as their shadows writhed and evaporated. Steel clashed against rotting bone, axes splitting skulls, pitchforks tearing through ribs. The survivors fought like cornered animals, every blow a scream of defiance against the abyss. Elias hurled himself into Samuel, the widow's fang carving through shadow and flesh alike. Each strike left smoking wounds that refused to close. Samuel staggered, his laughter broken into growls of fury. He struck back with crushing chains, sending Elias reeling, ribs cracking under the impact. But Elias rose again, spitting blood, eyes blazing. The fang pulsed in his hands as if feeding off his rage. With a roar, he drove the weapon deep into Samuel's chest. The revenant howled, chains thrashing wildly as black ichor sprayed across the cobblestones. For a moment, silence fell. The swarm faltered, their movements jerking as though their strings had been cut. Hope lit in the survivors' eyes. And then, Marianne stepped forward. Her gaze burned brighter than fire, her smile sharp as a blade. She raised her hand, and Samuel's body, still impaled on the widow's fang, began to heal. The shadows surged back into him, stitching his body together faster than before. The chain around his chest glowed red, burning with renewed power. Elias staggered back in disbelief. No, it should have killed him. Marianne's voice rolled like thunder. The fang may wound the servant, but the master cannot die. The ground trembled, buildings collapsing into ash. From the black sky above, something vast stirred, as though the night itself bent down to watch. The true curse of Blackwood was not Samuel. It was something older, darker, something now awake. Writing. The sky itself seemed to tear open. Clouds boiled into shapes that should not exist, faces screaming, twisted jaws biting at nothing, eyes that blinked and then vanished. The stars disappeared behind a veil of black smoke, and the moon cracked like glass. From that rift above, a sound rolled over Blackwood. Not thunder, not wind. Something deeper. A voice that was not a voice. An ancient resonance that made bones ache and souls tremble. The very ground quivered beneath its weight. The townsfolk fell to their knees, clutching their ears, blood seeping from their noses. Torches sputtered, flames dimming, as though the fire itself feared what approached. Elias forced himself to stand against the crushing weight of that presence. His vision blurred, but he gripped the widow's fang like a drowning man clings to driftwood. What is it?" he gasped. Marianne's laughter danced over the chaos. She spread her arms wide, her gown flowing into the streets like a river of shadows. "You fight my servant, my chains, my hunger, but now you will meet the master of the curse." The rift widened, and something enormous pressed against the veil of the sky. A claw the size of a house, blacker than night, slid through first. Its talons dug into the horizon, splitting the heavens as it pulled itself forward. Then came the head, horned, jawless, with 1,000 teeth gnashing where a mouth should be. Its eyes burned with void, not flame, as though they swallowed light whole. The ground cracked, fountains of ash spewing upward as the air turned heavy and unbreathable. The survivors screamed prayers, curses, anything they could as the colossal thing lowered itself toward Blackwood. Each movement threatened to crush the town beneath its shadow. Marianne bowed her head to the abomination, her fiery eyes alight with devotion. Behold, the hollow sovereign. Elias staggered backward, the fang pulsing so violently in his hands it nearly burned his skin. He realized then, this weapon had not been forged to fight Samuel or Marianne. It had been made for this, for the master. And now, as the hollow sovereign's shadow consumed Blackwood, Elias knew his fight had only just begun. Writing, the hollow sovereign loomed above Blackwood, its vast body blotting out the sky. Every heartbeat seemed to echo inside its presence, like drums of war pounding in the marrow of the living. Its thousand teeth gnashed in silence, yet the very soundlessness of it was more horrifying than a scream. Elias gripped the widow's fang tighter, the weapon glowing brighter with each step the abomination took. His skin blistered where he held it, but he refused to let go. The survivors behind him clung to one another, their faces pale and streaked with soot, waiting for their doom. Marianne's laughter rang sharp as broken glass. "Do you see now, Elias Graves? Your defiance has done nothing but summon the end faster. The Sovereign does not sleep forever. It only waits for fools to wake it." The ground trembled as Samuel rose again, his wound sealed, his chains ignited with red fire. He stood at Marianne's side, silent, awaiting his queen's command. Elias's breath came ragged, but the fang pulsed in his hands as though answering something older than Marianne's curse. For the first time he heard its voice, not words, but an urge, ancient and fierce. The weapon wanted blood. The weapon wanted the Sovereign. A memory flickered in his mind, his grandmother's stories whispered by firelight about an old iron fang hidden beneath the chapel, forged from sorrow and sacrifice. He had thought them tales to scare children, but here, in the shadow of the Sovereign, the truth burned in his grip. He raised the fang high, its pale fire blazing so bright it pushed back the darkness for a moment. The hollow Sovereign froze, its void eyes narrowing, the air cracked with pressure, as though the universe itself disapproved. Elias shouted over the roar of the abomination, "If you want this land, you'll choke on it. Come for me." With that, he charged. Samuel met him first, chains lashing like whips. Sparks showered the street as Elias blocked, parried and struck, his every move fueled by desperation. Around them, the survivors found courage in his defiance, hurling torches at the revenants, striking with whatever strength they had left. And then Elias broke through Samuel's guard. With a cry that tore his throat raw, he drove the widow's fang straight into the chain that bound Samuel's chest. The metal screamed like a living thing. Light erupted, and for the first time, Samuel fell. The hollow Sovereign howled, its soundless cry shattering windows and toppling walls. Marianne's smile faltered, her fiery eyes narrowing as she felt the chain break. Elias, bloodied and shaking, wrenched the fang free. He looked up at the Sovereign towering above, its claw now lowering toward him like a mountain of shadow. The fang pulsed once more, hotter than ever. It whispered not for Samuel, not for Marianne, but for the Master itself. Writing. The hollow Sovereign lowered itself toward Blackwood, its immense claw raking through the air. Each movement bent reality, warping the buildings into twisted shapes before they crumbled to ash. The mere nearness of the entity tore at the fabric of the world. Elias stood his ground, the widow's fang blazing with pale fire in his grip. The survivors huddled behind him, some whispering prayers, others staring in silence at the monster that blotted out the sky. The Sovereign's void eyes fixed on him. The weight of its gaze drove Elias to his knees, every muscle trembling, blood dripping from his nose and ears. His body screamed for surrender, for collapse, but the fang pulsed stronger, searing his hands, holding him upright. Marianne's voice rose in triumph. "Kneel, Elias Graves, kneel before your God." With a roar torn from his soul, Elias pushed to his feet, staggering under the Sovereign's shadow. He raised the widow's fang high, its light flaring so bright it carved through the darkness like dawn breaking. For a heartbeat, the Sovereign recoiled, its titanic head tilting back in recognition. And then it struck. The claw slammed down, shattering the earth in a blast of fire and ash. Elias leapt aside at the last moment, rolling across the ground as the cobblestones split where he had stood. The shockwave threw survivors into walls, the town collapsing around them. Elias rose, chest heaving, and charged. He drove the fang into the claw of the hollow Sovereign, pale fire colliding with void. The world screamed. The abomination's talons recoiled, ichor as black as night raining down, burning holes into the earth. For the first time, the hollow Sovereign bled. The survivors gasped in disbelief. Marianne's smile faltered, her fiery eyes narrowing. The Sovereign shrieked, a soundless blast that shattered every window in Blackwood, splitting ears and breaking minds. Men fell screaming, clutching their heads, while revenants crumbled like sand in the blast. But Elias stood firm, the fang glowing brighter with each heartbeat. He realized now, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a key, a beacon, forged for this very moment. The hollow sovereign recoiled, but its vast body shifted again, coiling like a storm ready to strike once more. The battle between man and God had begun. Writing. The ground was nothing but rubble now, Blackwood reduced to a burning graveyard. The hollow sovereign coiled above, its vast body shifting like a storm-given flesh. Each movement threatened to tear the world open wider. Elias stood in the ruins, his chest heaving, his hands blistered and raw where they clutched the widow's fang. The weapon pulsed like a heartbeat, pale fire blazing along its jagged head, every beat synchronized with his own, faster, louder, until he no longer knew if it was his heart or the fang that kept him alive. The sovereign raised another claw, larger than a house, its shadow falling over Elias. He braced himself, preparing to strike again. And then Marianne stepped between them. Her gown of shadow flared outward, merging with the sovereign's darkness. Her fiery eyes burned brighter than ever as she raised her hands to the heavens. "No more defiance," she hissed. "You will not wound my God again." Elias lunged, swinging the fang at her, but Marianne caught the blade in her bare hat. Untoward shadows spilled from her palms, wrapping around the weapon, choking its light. Sparks hissed as fire and void fought for dominance. The strain ripped through Elias's body. His bones felt like they were splintering, his vision blurred with red. Still he pushed forward, teeth gritted, refusing to release the weapon. Marianne leaned close, her voice a whisper of venom. "You cannot kill what was never born." Samuel staggered to her side, chains dragging, half ruined from his earlier wound. With a roar, he swung one of his shackles at Elias. The blow struck his ribs, sending him sprawling across the broken earth. He coughed blood, struggling to rise, but his body trembled too violently. Marianne turned, lifting her hand toward the survivors cowering in the ruins. "Watch, Elias. Watch as those you swore to protect become offerings." Shadows surged toward the townsfolk, binding their limbs, dragging them screaming into the air. Mothers clutched their children as black tendrils wrapped tighter, pulling them toward the yawning void above. Elias forced himself onto his knees, fury blazing in his eyes. The fang burned hotter, its light piercing through the shadows, choking it. He staggered to his feet, raising it once more, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Over my dead body!" The weapon flared, a burst of pale fire ripping through the darkness, severing the tendrils holding the survivors. They fell to the ground, gasping, as the fang roared in Elias's grip. For a heartbeat, the sovereign paused. Marianne's smile faltered, her fiery eyes narrowing into rage. The true battle was not over, it was only building toward its reckoning. Writing. The ruins of Blackwood burned in silence except for the groans of dying wood and the low rumble of the hollow sovereign above. Ash fell like black snow, coating the shattered town in a veil of death. Elias stood at the center, widow's fang blazing in his hands, its pale fire flaring higher than ever before. Across from him, Marianne emerged from the shadows, her gown flowing like a storm tide of darkness. Her fiery eyes locked onto his, no longer amused, no longer mocking, only burning with fury. The duel began with no words. Marianne moved first, her hand slicing through the air. A spear of pure shadow erupted from the ground, aiming for Elias's heart. He twisted aside, the fang carving through it, its fire hissing as it split the darkness apart. She summoned another, and another, until the street bristled with black spears. Elias slashed, spun, dodged, his body screaming in pain but refusing to fall. With a roar he lunged, the fang arcing down at her. Marianne caught the blade in her hands once more, shadows coiling around it, but this time Elias forced the weapon through. The pale fire burned her flesh, and for the first time Marianne screamed. Her voice split the night, shattering glass, driving the survivors to their knees. She retaliated with a storm of shadows that tore buildings apart, sending debris flying like shrapnel. Elias was hurled against a broken wall, blood streaking his face, but he rose again. He charged, the fang cutting through the storm, each strike brighter, faster, fueled by rage and the memory of every life lost. They clashed again in the heart of the ruined square, her hands wrapped in black flame, his weapon blazing white. Every impact sent shockwaves through the ground, splitting cobblestones, top. Its void eyes opened wider, and the world bent inward. Buildings collapsed into dust without a sound. The earth cracked, swallowing corpses and stone alike. It was no longer a battle for Blackwood. It was the beginning of unmaking itself. Marianne, her chest still bleeding fire, staggered forward and fell to her knees before the creature. Her voice was raw, but exultant. "Take me, my lord. I give you my body, my soul. Let me be your vessel." The sovereign's gaze fell upon her. Shadows wrapped around her frame, lifting her from the ground. Her body contorted, stretched, and broke in ways no human could survive. Bones snapped, flesh tore, yet her laughter never ceased. Her fiery eyes burned brighter, fusing with the void as the monster claimed her. When the shadows receded, Marianne no longer stood as a woman. She towered, half human, half abomination, her body warped into a perfect union with the sovereign. Her gown of shadow had become wings of darkness, her voice layered with the resonance of the god itself. She spread her arms wide, her voice thundering across the ruins. "Elias Graves, come forward. You have been chosen. If you can strike me down, the sovereign may fall. If you cannot, your world ends here." Elias staggered, the fang blazing like a star in his grip. His body trembled on the edge of collapse, but there was no retreat, no refuge. This was the final test, the duel not only for Blackwood, but for the very fate of the living. Writing, the ruins of Blackwood trembled under the presence of the hybrid form. Marianne, no longer just the plantation heiress, no longer merely cursed, spread her wings of living shadow wide, each beat of them sending hurricanes through the shattered streets. Her voice, now carrying both her own fury and the hollow sovereign's depthless hunger, echoed like thunder. "Elias Graves, kneel." The words alone carried enough force to splinters. Stone. The survivors who still clung to life were crushed to the ground, blood seeping from their ears. Samuel writhed, chains rattling as though they burned his flesh, his hollow loyalty breaking under the weight of the command. But Elias did not kneel. The widow's fang blazed like a sun in his grip, the fire so bright it blinded him, searing his skin and bones. His legs trembled, but his back remained straight. He raised the weapon, and his voice, raw and broken, carried over the storm. "You've taken the fields, the slaves, the town, but you'll take nothing more, not while I still breathe." Marianne's laugh was a choir of voices, human and monstrous. "Then breathe your last." She descended. The duel began in a storm of shadow and fire. Her wings crashed against the ground, splitting the earth. Her claws swept like scythes, carving trenches in stone. Elias met every strike with the fang, the blade screaming with each clash, white fire against black void. Every impact shook the ruins, every clash split the night with shockwaves. She drove him back, blow after blow, her strength now unearthly, her movements faster than the eye could follow. He stumbled, bleeding from dozens of cuts, his breath ragged. His heart thundered as if ready to burst, yet he fought on. A claw caught him across the chest. He crashed through the remains of a wall, coughing blood. His vision swam, the fang slipping from his grasp, until a memory steadied his hand. His wife's smile, his son's laughter, the town he swore to protect. He stood again. With a roar, Elias lunged, the fang carving a path through the shadows. Marianne shrieked, her monstrous form twisting aside, but the blade found her shoulder, burning deep into flesh that was no longer entirely human. She howled, wings thrashing violently, toppling buildings in her agony. "You cannot kill me," she thundered. "I am eternal." But Elias, bloodied and broken, only tightened his grip. His voice was low, steady, unshaken. "Then eternity ends tonight." The fang flared brighter than ever before, and for the first time, the sovereign's gaze wavered. The night of ruin burned like no other. Blackwood was no longer a town, but a graveyard of ash, shadow, and fire. At its heart, Elias stood, broken, bloodied, yet unyielding. Across from him loomed Marianne, the hollow sovereign's vessel, her monstrous wings blotting out the stars. Their battle had torn the world apart, yet it was not strength alone that decided this fight. It was will. Marianne struck again, her claw descending like the blade of a god. Elias raised the widow's fang, and for an instant time froze. The weapon pulsed not with fire but with memory. Every soul lost on the plantation, every cry from the cane fields, every innocent who fell beneath the curse. Their voices poured into Elias, their strength binding his failing body upright. The fang erupted, not as a blade of steel, but as a pillar of light. Elias ducked him, move it forward. The strike pierced through Marianne's chest, through the darkness of the sovereign, tearing sky and shadow alike. She screamed, not in triumph, not in fury, but in despair. Her monstrous form unraveled, shadows bursting like smoke on the wind. The sovereign's eyes flickered, dimmed, and with a soundless roar, the abomination imploded, dragged back into the rift from which it came. The world fell silent. Marianne collapsed. Her body returned to its human shape, though pale and lifeless. For the first time, her face was free of rage. She looked almost at peace. Elias fell to his knees, the fang crumbling into dust in his hands. His chest heaved once, twice, and then he too slumped forward, his body finally surrendering to its wounds. When dawn broke, the survivors crawled from the ruins. Samuel was gone, his chains lying broken in the square. The plantation, the curse, the town, it was all over. The tale of Blackwood became a whisper, then a legend. Some said the hollow sovereign still stirred in dreams, waiting. Others swore Elias's spirit walked the fields at night, guarding against its return. But one truth remained. The curse had ended, paid for in fire, shadow, and sacrifice.